In the next 40 years, economic efficiency is not the only factor deciding collaboration between countries or the location of supply chains. We are talking about now the concept of autonomy. We are talking about the concept of economic security.
Taiwan produces not just 20% of the world's semiconductors, but 92% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors, those operating at the sub-7 nanometer level. Yes, should there be a disruption of chip supply from the island of Taiwan, that would be highly dangerous and deleterious to the entire global economy.
Everyone knows China wants to catch up in high-tech, in semiconductor manufacturing. But there's one important thing, as for now, China is lack of, is the trust from other country, from your customer. That trust is very important because if you want to kind of have the semiconductor manufacturing, your customer have to kind of give you the IP, the trade secret for you to manufacture their own chip.
Welcome to TaiwanPlus Point. I'm Yin Khvat. After China's military action, we take a look at where this leaves Taiwan's semiconductor industry. In the studio, I'm joined by Wu Ziyi, Vice President of the government-sponsored research lab Industrial Technology Research Institute, and Roy Lee, Deputy Director of Taiwan WTO Center at the Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research. And earlier, I spoke with Stephen Ezell, Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who spoke to me from Washington. First, let's take a look at Taiwan's position in the global semiconductor industry.
Taiwan is a powerhouse of global chips production, which are needed in everything from phones and cars to household appliances and high-tech weapons. Taiwanese companies are part of the global foundry market. A foundry makes chips that are designed by consumer or military customers. Let's take a look at how Taiwan is leading the semiconductor business. Here, you can see the share of the market by country. In 2022, Taiwan is projected to take a whopping 66% of global market share. South Korea is next at 17%, followed by China at 8%. You can see from 2021 that Taiwan's share has grown 2%, widening its hold on the global market. And of Taiwan's 66% revenue, more than 80% is estimated to come from local hero, TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Let's take a look at TSMC's position in the industry. For the most advanced chips, TSMC is the leader of the pack, as you can see from this chart. It accounts for around 90% of the revenue of 5 to 10 nanometer chips, while only one other foundry, Samsung, takes a 10% share. For the 12 to 32 nanometer chips, TSMC holds around 70% of the share of revenue, while the United States Global Foundries and Samsung come in second and third place. Taiwan's UMC, the United Microelectronics Corporation, comes in fourth, with China's SMIC trailing. And while TSMC's overall share of the lower-end chips decreases, it still takes the largest share of any company across all chips. Semiconductors are one of the world's most important assets, as highlighted during the pandemic. Let's take the US as an example of semiconductors' impact, since it is the world's biggest economy. The global chip shortage is thought to have taken 1% off of US GDP in 2021. That is the assessment from the director of the National Economic Council under US President Joe Biden. That's because even though semiconductors account for only 0.3% of US output, they are a production input to 12% of the GDP. The automotive industry has perhaps suffered the most. AlixPartners says the shortage will cost the industry an estimated $210 billion in lost revenue, or 7.7 million units in 2021 alone. Semiconductors are fundamental to our modern lives, making Taiwan incredibly important to the rest of the world.
Professor Wu, so we can see from these figures how powerful Taiwan is in the industry. There is this idea of TSMC itself being as powerful as governments. What are your thoughts on that?
I think TSMC is the most important company in Taiwan, that's without question. And I think as for now, TSMC probably is the top 10 from the market size, probably top 10 over in the whole world. So I think it is the most important company in Taiwan. But for TSMC, I don't think they were involved in a political issue, so I don't think we can call it very politically powerful.
Professor Lee.
Oh, I think TSMC is as important globally as it is to Taiwan. So it is one of the most important companies, not only to Taiwan, but globally, right? But also look at the powerfulness of TSMC. I would say TSMC is powerful in the sense, I fully agree with Professor Wu that it is not a political powerful company.
But economically?
Economically, and also it is a powerful company to highlight the importance of Taiwan and also to create the image of Taiwan, and most importantly, to build up the awareness globally that Taiwan matters for everybody. So I think TSMC, it is a powerful company. Then sometimes Taiwanese government, by transmitting, communicating this message that Taiwan is important, Taiwan has its own identity, and it is a contributor to the global economic growth.
Professor Wu, as China recently drilled for an attack on Taiwan, what was going through the minds of TSMC's executives? Were they worried?
I cannot speak for their mind, but as a company, I think they do have some risk management even before the drill. So they would diversify their product, their portfolio, their supply chain, and they would diversify their customer. So they would do the risk management. So they have actually manufacturer plant not only in Taiwan. As for now they have a manufacturer plant in United States and in China. So they do have the risk management to avoid some incident or the war around Taiwan. But I cannot speak with what goes through their mind.
Professor Lee, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, look at the actions of TSMC's diversification plan. You realize that TSMC is aware of the geopolitical and other risks that is taking place around this region and in other parts of the world. And that is exactly the reason, as Professor Wu mentioned, why TSMC made the decision to invest in the US. But they have a facility, actually 2 facilities in China in the last 10 years. Now they are having a mega factory in the US, and also a joint venture in Japan. And there are news reports indicating that there will be a new facility also in the European soil. So I think diversification is the key word in addressing all kind of risks, and TSMC is doing exactly that.
Taiwanese chip companies are keen to continue selling their products to across the globe, including China, and they don't want to be forced to choose customers. We saw how United Microelectronics Corp distanced itself from its retired founder, Robert Tsao, after he donated $100 million to Taiwan's defense. And then I'm quoting here now Mark Liu in a CNN interview. He said, "I hope that we don't get discriminated because we are close to China. No matter your relationship with China, Taiwan is Taiwan." Professor Wu, do you agree with this approach?
Sure, I'm 100% agree with Mark Liu say. And actually, Taiwan is Taiwan, and actually Taiwan, for example, TSMC, is under operation in the current economical and the political system. If there is a war or China take over Taiwan, as Mark Liu say, it's not operable, because for a semiconductor, for the operation, you have to communicate with your customer, with your supplier on a daily basis. If China take over Taiwan, that communication probably would kind of disrupt.
So your argument is that it makes sense to keep selling to China because this is a deterrent against an attack on
Yes.
Taiwan. Is that correct?
Yes, and as Mark Liu say, the revenue from China probably 10% of TSMC's revenue, and their cell phone, a lot of their chip, their kind of the GPU, it's made by TSMC. If there's something happen between Taiwan and China, it will also impact the economy of China. And I think that's what Mark Liu say.
Professor Lee, let me quote again Mark Liu's words in the CNN interview. He said, "Our interruption will create great economic turmoil on either side in China because their most advanced component supply disappeared. And it is an interruption, I must say. So people will think twice on this." And yet, Professor Lee, there are some people now who are saying their positions have shifted. Now they believe China might, in fact, want to invade Taiwan because they want to own this incredible asset, TSMC. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think China will think more than twice, right? Because at this moment, China imports 70% of its demand for semiconductors from Taiwan and South Korea, right? So South Korea and Taiwan basically are the two only source of supplies for China to maintain its position as the global factory of electronic products, right? Unless China wants to move away from this source of growth in the last 40 years and create something else. Otherwise, China will continue to have its demand for semiconductors from Taiwan, right? So it is the kind of dependency from the Chinese side on the importation of Taiwanese chips that we are seeing is a prevention of further escalation of conflicts, right? So that is why I think China needs to think more than twice on this dimension. The idea of taking over Taiwan and taking over TSMC it's a rhetoric, politically or even during daily conversation, but it doesn't make any commercial sense because TSMC's success is based on the talents. It's based on the people working within TSMC, the prediction, their forward-looking ideas, and their devotions into technology leadership. So it's about it's a human-based.
Management, or are you talking about
the entire system?
But a takeover by China doesn't preclude that they could also take over a large part of their workforce.
Well, they can take the people physically, right? But they cannot control the way they work and their continuation of their efforts and also their devotion into the process of innovation, right? So TSMC can be take over by force, but you cannot take the spirit and the value of TSMC through military intervention, and it will be useless. It will be more cost-effective if for China to focus on developing its own semiconductor industry rather than taking over
Professor
TSMC
Wu, do you
by
agree?
force.
Yes, yeah, I do agree. So
that it would be more cost-effective for China to try to build up its own ecosystems, its own companies, rather than to take over TSMC.
As I mentioned just before, the TSMC, if China take over TSMC, because it's not operable and it will cost much higher than build their own infrastructure or their own semiconductor manufacturer plant. That's for true.
Let's go now for the US perspective to Stephen Ezell. He is Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington. I began by asking him whether China's military action triggered fears in the US for Taiwan's chip industry. Let's take a look.
It is semiconductors that are fundamentally driving the global digital economy. They're at the brains of all of our high-tech devices, from cars to airplanes. And when you see that the island of Taiwan produces not just 20% of the world's semiconductors, but 92% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors, those operating at the sub-7 nanometer level, yes, should there be a disruption of chip supply from the island of Taiwan, that would be, highly dangerous and deleterious to the entire global economy.
You said before that Taiwan has an outsized contribution to America's security and economic interests. Can you summarize why that is?
Considering the equation from a purely economic security perspective, we've already talked about how important the supply of Taiwanese semiconductors are to the U.S. and to the global economy. But it's not just that Taiwan supplies semiconductors. In fact, 86% of Taiwan's exports going to the United States, and the United States is Taiwan's second largest trading partner, but 86% of those exports are intermediate goods that fill into finished products in the US supply chain for things like automobiles, like airplanes, like electromachinery and capital equipment. So when we look at the combination of Taiwan's intermediate inputs into the US economy, they're greater than those of Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam combined.
An attack on Taiwan, what impact would that have on the global supply chains? Can you paint a picture of what the global impact might be?
Well, there's no question that it would be absolutely devastating. A consulting organization here in the United States called the Boston Consulting Group estimated that it would cost global electronic device manufacturers alone $500 billion. While if complete disruption were to become permanent, it could take a minimum of 3 years and $350 billion of investment to rebuild enough capacity across the rest of the world to replace the lost production from Taiwanese foundries. And that's just 1 year of potential disruption. And of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be an armed conflict. If China were to decide to blockade or to prevent exports from the island, that would have a similar effect.
China has been trying to make the same sort of chips as Taiwan for years, but failed. Why is that the case?
First is that innovating at the leading edge of semiconductor design is enormously expensive and requires enormous economies of scale. And the install base of human capital knowledge, of technical knowledge, is not easy at all to replicate. That would be, I think, the most fundamental factor. Secondly, in our view, is that the way in which China has gone about trying to develop its semiconductor ecosystem, essentially what you have is a set of strategies that are closed loop. They are designed in such a way that they're not voluntarily incorporating talent and knowledge and intellectual property from the rest of the world. So then China has to go about those types of policies by either trying to steal intellectual property, by trying to acquire foreign competitors, or by trying to attract engineers to like the 1,000 Talents program. So the point is, if you're designing a system and you're trying to support an industry that is walled off from global best practice, global best of breed, then you're going to, by definition, be putting yourself at a disadvantage and making it harder to innovate in this sector, despite the fact that China is able to throw tens of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of engineers at them. So the failure to compete, in our view, is kind of a result of, frankly, the communist system.
Joe Biden has just signed into law the $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act, and this is essentially to boost manufacturing capability on US soil, as well as to compete with China in terms of their science and technology. Do you believe this bill will be effective?
Well, I would respond that it certainly has the potential to be effective. Important to recognize in this legislation two really discrete parts of it. $76 billion is semiconductor specific. Now, separately, the other $200 billion in the legislation is really the Science Act. What was the $200 billion in the science part of legislation will still have to be appropriated by Congress over the course of this year. Now, that said, what Congress has achieved here is undoubtedly a landmark, generational, transformative investment in America's science enterprise, whereas the U.S. clearly used to be number one in the world in federal funding of scientific R&D. We've now fallen to 9th among OECD countries. So there was a real need to restore U.S. leadership, both in terms of our own historical norms as well as our global peers, and how much we're investing in the seed corn of innovation for the future.
What do you see as the future landscape for global semiconductors?
Semiconductor demand is expected to increase nearly 60% over the remainder of this decade, growing from a $570 billion to $1 trillion industry by the end of the decade. So there are going to be dozens of fabs that will need to be built around the world to supply. The new electric vehicles are going to have as many as 3,000 semiconductors per car, right? So there's tremendous opportunity. TSMC, Taiwanese company, of course, has invested or announced investments of $150 billion of capex over the next 3 years alone. That said, there is another dynamic that will significantly begin to impact this industry over the remainder of the decade, and that's the fact that Moore's law is ending. Of course, that was the famous proclamation by Gordon Moore, then head of Intel, that every 2 years or so, the processing power of a semiconductor doubles while its price halves. But now we're getting as we move from 5 to 3 to 2 nanometers, we're getting at the kind of the end of the edge of the physics behind how our semiconductors are currently designed. And so when we get kind of 2, maybe 1's the limit, right? So what that means is in the next decade, there are going to be entirely new types of semiconductor chips design, 3-dimensional semiconductors, neuromorphic semiconductors. And I say this because once we have kind of technology leaping up to a new S-curve, it creates the potential for there to be entirely new technology architectures, and meaning entirely new companies and new entrants who come into the field. So it's going to be interesting to see if the companies currently at the leading edge are able to make kind of that leap as we move into a whole new generation of semiconductor process manufacturing, or whether a new set of entrants are the Googles making the semiconductors of tomorrow.
That was Stephen Ezell speaking to me earlier. We mentioned there the $280 billion CHIPS Act, which was signed by Joe Biden into law. Professor Lee, now the CHIPS Act is about competing with China, but will it also erode Taiwan's chip industry?
There is a potential risk in the long term that Taiwan will face an increased level of competition because of the CHIPS Act. Because if you look at the content of that piece of legislation, it comes with 3 components. The first part, of course, is the grant to support the development of a domestic US-based manufacturing capacity of semiconductors. But also there's a second part of the legislation to facilitate R&D research and development of semiconductors.
Yeah, as Stephen mentioned.
That's right. And also there is a third part, which is to facilitate the capacity training for talents working in the semiconductor industry. Right. So at this moment, the first part, the grant for manufacturing capacity in the US, I think Taiwan, South Korea, for the time being, will be receiving a fair, equal treatment as with US competitors. But for the R&D part and also the talent training part, I think that's the source of competition that I described in the long run, right? So if the US decided that they are going to catch up in, for example, next generation semiconductor technologies, and also they are decided to accelerate the talent cultivation training programs, I think Taiwan will face an increasing level of competition. But the key is, in the global semiconductor supply chain, Taiwan's position is a contract the provider of a contract manufacturing services. So that means for chip design, for example, Qualcomm, which is the major supplier of smartphone processors, they predict the market demand, and they design accordingly of the smartphones processors needed 2 years from now. But they don't have a factory to commercialize their concept. So they will have a contract with TSMC to deliver the design of the contract and also manufacture the design on behalf of Qualcomm.
Okay, so Qualcomm designs and
Qualcomm
TSMC
sells the chip, but the manufacturing of that chip is actually taking place by TSMC or UMC. So unless they want to move away from this, the most efficient way of collaboration between design house, marketing branding name, and the contract manufacturers, unless they don't want to continue this efficient way of collaboration. Otherwise, they will need TSMC in the long run anyway.
So you're saying if we want to move, the current model is a supply chain where different parts of the world have different expertise.
Yes.
And it looks like with the CHIPS Act, they want to have localization.
But not necessarily. The CHIPS Act is not encouraging Qualcomm to become an integrated provider, such that Qualcomm design the chip but also manufacture the chip in-house. Right. I don't think it's changing. It's not changing that. It's actually encouraging contract manufacturers such as TSMC to bring their facility closer to Qualcomm, to be located in the United States, rather than making Qualcomm to think that maybe I should produce the chips in my own capacity. I don't think they are changing that.
Professor Wu, yes. However, is that the next stage after this?
I totally agree with Professor Lee just saying. So one of the reasons TSMC is so successful is because of this pure foundry service. So they make they fabricate the chip for Qualcomm, Apple, Google, Amazon. And for those brand company, they don't have to make their own chip. They can just focus on design and the marketing and selling the product. So, and I think that's the advantage for TSMC. And in the long run, I don't think this advantage will be changed because this model works very well for now. Go back to Qualcomm. I don't think it's effective for them to build their own company, their own manufacturing plant, because it's easily cost $100 billion of US dollar. So it doesn't make sense for them to do that. So I think this pure foundry service model will continue for at least 10, 20 years. So in the long run, I don't think this CHIPS Act will kind of erode the advantage or leading position of TSMC.
Professor Lee, to what extent does the CHIPS Act address the challenges that Morris Chang has voiced? He recently said that it doesn't make sense to have a fab, say, in the US, where the costs are much greater than in Taiwan for labor, and there are also other issues. Does the CHIPS Act help to address these issues?
Well, it addressed partially the concern Morris Chang expressed. What Morris was highlighting is the fact that it's actually recognized by the US government's report that cost of production in the US is at least 40% to 70% higher than elsewhere. So they understand that there will be a cost difference. So the first objective of the CHIPS Act is actually to minimize the gap, the cost differences between producing in the US soil versus producing in Taiwan and elsewhere, right? But again, because of the limitation of the size of the budget, it can only facilitate or try to address the gap, the cost difference partially. They cannot recover the differences completely. So that means companies such as TSMC or Samsung still have to bear some of the extra costs associated with relocating in the United States, right? So what Morris Chang is arguing is that, look, we understand there's a national security or economic security need for the US to create domestic manufacturing capacity, but you have to think twice and limit the size of that relocation. You can have a small size capacity rebuilt in the United States, yeah, but not the entire ecosystem. So Taiwan should remain to be the hub of global semiconductor manufacturing. I think that's the idea.
Professor Wu, Taiwan remaining the center hub of semiconductor manufacturing, and yet we've just experienced China's biggest military drills on record. Is there a huge danger with this being centered on Taiwan?
I think there's always some risk, for some accident to happen, like a war or earthquake or some nature disaster. So there are always.
You mean in any parts of the world?
In any parts. And even though people are kind of worried about there might be a risk of war, kind of between Taiwan and China. If there's really a war, it won't affect just Taiwan. It will affect Japan. It will affect Korea. Yes. So so for semiconductor, probably 70% of the semiconductor are manufactured in Taiwan, Japan, or Korea. You cannot move all those manufacturer kind of facility of factory away from Eastern Asia. That just doesn't make sense. And of course, we have to pay attention to the risk. That's why we just talk about the risk management. So I agree, there should be sites in United States or in Europe or in other country. But I think Taiwan will still keep the center hub position, probably in the near future, because of the ecosystem, the infrastructure built around the Taiwan. It's not easy to kind of replicate from other countries.
Talking about this idea of Taiwan being in the lead and other countries seeking to replicate, TSMC's nearest rivals are Samsung in South Korea and SMIC in China. How far in advance is TSMC compared to these nearest rivals, Professor Lee? How much of a threat are they?
Well, I think TSMC's gap with Samsung is closing up. Samsung has been announcing some kind of breakthrough in 5 nanometer or moving into the 3 nanometer areas. So Samsung's announcement actually is a kind of surprise to the market, because the original prediction is that TSMC will be leading the way into 5 and 3 nanometer commercial production. So that is one of the examples that TSMC do face some competition from Samsung. SMIC from China will be at least 3 generations behind TSMC and Samsung. So if we describe TSMC Samsung competition as the tier 1 competition, I think SMIC at this moment is still in tier 2 or tier 3. So it's not, at least for the time being, not a direct threat to TSMC. So I think TSMC, if we are looking at the state of competition or competitors that TSMC face, I think Samsung will be the most credible competitor that TSMC has to pay attention to.
Professor Wu, talking about China, in the interview with Stephen, he mentioned that China's challenges, he believed one of the factors was actually their communist system, that it stifles innovation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. And actually, probably 2 weeks ago, Thomas Friedman, he wrote a column in New York Times. And he pointed out a very important thing is everyone knows China want to catch up in high tech, in semiconductor manufacturing. But there's one important thing, as for now, China is lack of, is the trust from other country, from your customer. That trust is very important, because if you want to kind of have the semiconductor manufacturing, your customer have to kind of give you the IP, the trade secret for you to manufacture their own chip. So they have to trust. They have to trust you in 2 ways. The first, ask you to manufacture their chip. You will not become their competitor in the future.
And this is why TSMC's pure foundry model works.
The second is that your customer has to trust you. You will not leak the information to someplace else, or even for your own company, and the kind of from the IP, from the trade secret. So the trust is the most important kind of, or the biggest kind of the roadblock for China to kind of reproduce or kind of advance in semiconductor or high-tech kind of business. That's something they have to conquer.
How about if it simply supplies itself?
Yes, as for now, they just simply supply for themselves. But that kind of won't sustain for a long term because even though China is the biggest market in the world, it's probably only take like 10 or 20% of the whole market in the world. So if they want to expand or play a more important role around the world, they have to go out. They cannot just kind of, as a closed system or closed community, just work on their own. That won't sustain long. That will probably sustain for a few years, but eventually they have to go out and collaborate with the whole world to make their technology, to make their market kind of expand more as compared to the current status.
Professor Lee, do you agree with Stephen Ezell and also Professor Wu about this closed loop system that it is holding China back?
Yes, that's one of the fundamental problem with the Chinese economic system or governance. Just two quick footnotes to add on all these arguments that's already been discussed. First, many of these innovations in China are actually man-made. It was produced by party guidelines or national interest guidelines rather than market demand predictions, right? So many of these development and innovation process is leading not to commercialization, but rather to serve the country's interest. But the country's interest is a very opaque, is vague and opaque concept. So without innovation, without the support of market or without the support of commercial demand, the base is very hollow, and also the long-term implication of that innovation is very limited. So that's one additional problem that the Chinese system face. The second problem is distortion, because the demand is man-made, because the demand is guided by party direction or policies, distortions take place in the process because there are so many stakeholders involved, and many of the stakeholders are serving their own interests rather than the parties or the state interests. So they pocket the grants provided by governments without delivering the innovation, and also they distort wherever they can. So it will be a very inefficient system to pursue the level of innovation or the level of breakthrough that they want in the first place, right? So all these add up to the limitations that we discussed in the Chinese way of economic governance.
Professor Wu, moving to the future, we heard there that Stephen Ezell talked about limitations, the physical limitations of getting to 1 nanometer, and he talked about why this makes R&D and innovation so much more important as we push forward. Do you believe that Taiwan can keep innovating and leading into that future?
Yes, I do. And actually now people talk about 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, 1 nanometer. Actually that name is a little bit misleading. It doesn't mean any physical size in the chip is 1 nanometer. It's not that mean. It's a long history. I don't want to comment on that. But for the people in semiconductor industry, a lot of us do believe the so-called Moore's law can keep kind of for at least another 10 years. And Taiwan will work on that, and I think Taiwan will lead the kind of the semiconductor innovation and keep this advantage for probably 5 to 10 years. I think that's for the even beyond 1 nanometer, I think Taiwan still have those advantage.
Professor Lee, Mark Liu has said the 2030s belongs to TSMC. You spoke about South Korea's Samsung catching up. What do you think will happen to Taiwan, to TSMC in the future?
There's a very important dimension here. The competition will become a serious problem for Taiwan and South Korea on the condition that market stop to grow. So as long as market continue to grow, as long as the demand for advanced chips continue to grow, I think TSMC will be enjoying the benefits, and as well as Samsung capturing the extra demand that has been growing in the last 10 years. So based on most of the predictions, the demand for advanced chips will continue to increase in the next 2 decades because of all these new applications that are taking place right now. And as long as TSMC is able to maintain its leadership in manufacturing technologies, in manufacturing efficiency, and most importantly in serving its clients in the most efficient way, I think TSMC, I don't see any even long run problem with TSMC maintaining its current leadership in the contract manufacturing services of semiconductors.
I want to go back to the CHIPS Act. So China says it is firmly opposed to this legislation. It says that it will restrict the normal activities of Chinese companies. Why?
So as far as I know, the CHIPS Act actually mentioned that if any company kind of receive the grant from United States for semiconductor, they cannot expand the investment in China in advanced technology. So of course China will oppose that.
So that's a condition of accepting the grant?
Yes, that's the condition for accepting the grant. So of course China will kind of oppose this CHIPS Act. But for CHIPS Act, not just United States have CHIPS Act. European have the CHIPS Act. Actually, China itself have their own CHIPS Act for the past 20 years. So every country will try to kind of maintain or kind of gaining the position in semiconductor manufacturing or semiconductor industry. So they will have some law to kind of protect their own semiconductor industry. And that's just the competition. And to me, it's a healthy competition because for semiconductor to kind of get to more advanced technology, you need competition. So you can bring out more innovation. I think that's a healthy competition.
Professor Lee, do they have the same condition on accepting their grant?
Well, right now the CHIPS Act from the European area is not imposing. I mean, it's still a draft. It's not finalized. It's not complete. The legislation process hasn't been completed yet in Europe side. So we're not sure whether there will be take benchmarking the U.S. experience by adding limitation on future investment in China. But the current draft doesn't impose that kind of condition. But I think Professor Wu highlights a very important fact that China is actually the leader in semiconductor autonomy policy. It started this process 20 years ago. It's still continuing under the Made in China 2025 and the 14th five-year economic plan as one of the priorities to pursue a higher level of chip autonomy, right? So that's the official term. So yeah, if the CHIPS Act is a kind of abbreviation of countries' efforts to increase the level of autonomy, China knows very well why countries are pursuing this objective, right? So the condition will be very different, but I think they are all pointing to the same direction that all countries want to maintain, at least, they want to first of all reduce the reliance on imports. So they want to increase the level of domestic supply network. That's the direction. They utilize different tools, legislative tools, policy tools, government efforts, and other education grants and other.
And is it true to say there's two drivers of this? One is the pandemic, where it showed,
the other is the strategic competition with China. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So well, the pandemic is phasing out, right? I mean the impact of pandemic, but the U.S. China and even the EU China long-term strategic competition or even strategic rivalry will continue in the next 2 decades, right? So that's if all countries are developing into that direction, I think chips autonomy will become a very popular and continue to be a popular policy direction.
So we are moving into this new era of fragmented supply chains, where before it was global.
Yes.
Now it's
Yes.
become fragmented
Yes.
along perhaps lines, ideological lines of democracy versus autocracy. Where is Taiwan's role in this?
Well, in theory, we don't like the idea of fragmentation because fragmentation means inefficiency. But unfortunately, economic efficiency is the dominating concept in the last 40 years. And the outcome of that concept is the global supply chain. So countries with different ideologies, with different values, work together in the pursuance of economic efficiency. Unfortunately, in the next 40 years, economic efficiency is not the only factor deciding collaboration between countries or the location of supply chains. We are talking about now the concept of autonomy. We are talking about the concept of economic security. So in the US perspective, they want to reduce reliance on China. They want to stop feeding China with resources and capital and talents as a way to win, to maintain its advantage through the process of competition with China, right? So it's not only 3 nanometers. US also wants US-based suppliers to reduce its presence in China, to move to friends territories. But we need to recognize that that is the reality, that is the economic reality in the next 20 years. And especially for industries, and also for government, small-sized country like Taiwan, governments also need to recognize the fact that the good old days are gone. We have to understand that's the way to go. So we need to address the new demands and new realities accordingly.
Professor Wu, is it the death of globalization? And in this new era, let's say TSMC, will it choose China or the US?
So in theory, of course, we want to have a free economic, we want to have a globalization, but in reality, there are always political issues in between. So for us or for TSMC, I think the best strategy is to still lead the technology. If you have the leading position in your innovation, in your technology you can provide, you don't have to worry about this, because no matter how the political issue or the fragmentation, the people or your customer will still come to you because you can provide the most cost-effective, most advanced technology for them. I think TSMC will, or the Taiwanese semiconductor industry will still survive in this kind of political issue, as long as we keep the innovation and the leading the technology.
I think fragmentation is bad in the sense that it's not consistent with economic theories, but it also creates positive implications for Taiwan. Imagine a world that is pursuing maximizing economic efficiency. In this kind of global economic order, China will always dominate the system because of its size, because of its position as a world factory, because of its support to attract investments and other inputs.
The state support.
That's right. So in a world economic order that is dominated by China, Taiwan constantly faces the pressure of marginalization, right? But imagine we are looking at 2 separate worlds, a world without China and a world with China at the center. I think Taiwan will find more space, more opportunities to collaborate with other partners, other like-minded countries in a fragmented world that China is not dominating. So we remove actually the pressure being pushed to the corner. So from Taiwan's perspective, I think it might be a good thing for Taiwan. But the key is, can we capture the opportunities or the benefits as the supply chain becomes fragmented? But we are looking at positive implications as well. And these positive implications are not available for other countries. They don't really understand why Taiwan is feeling excited facing a fragmented network. But a fragmented network is something probably Taiwan is for Taiwan's benefit.
US House Speaker visited Taiwan. She had lunch with Maurice Chang and Mark Liu. And analysts here are saying that this actually put a lot of pressure on Taiwanese semiconductor companies. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think so. I think if there's pressure, TSMC will continue to face the pressure from the US side, with or without a lunch with Pelosi. Rather, I think Pelosi's visit or invitation to this gentleman to join her for lunch is actually a demonstration of non-discriminatory treatment. Because let's recall, President Biden just visited Samsung about 3 weeks ago during his summit state visit to South Korea, right? And he visited actually not Samsung, but also other chip making companies, right? So the visit by the president of the US is actually not necessarily adding pressure, but also to highlight their appreciation of South Korea's importance in the semiconductor sector, right? Now, President Biden probably, we are not seeing any opportunity for him to visit Taiwan. So I think the best way to make TSMC feeling being treated fairly or on an equal footing is to invite Ms. Speaker Pelosi, who is a close friend to President Biden, to visit TSMC and other chip-making companies. So I think it's a show of appreciation. It's a demonstration of non-discriminatory treatment by the U.S. government rather than adding on pressure. So it's actually a happy lunch rather than a very expensive lunch.
Okay, well, we have to end it there. Thank you very much to our guests, Wu Ziyi and Roy Lee. For more point shows, please download the TaiwanPlus app. Stay safe and see you next time.